perfect is perfect, right? And again, once you get to perfect, now the conversation shifts to what do you prefer? Perfect in those days is like everything I mentioned, plus those Steely Dan albums you mentioned, right? And it just means you've got, to me, a perfect production coming out of the 70s is you don't have to turn your treble all the way up to be satisfied. You don't have to turn your bass up all the way up to be satisfied.
What is the perfect record? Sound wise, The Nightfly by Donald Fagen comes up an awful lot. The Steely Dan albums come up. There's an album that I have by Tarney Spencer, Three's a Crowd. They used to test stereos with this when I was in my early 20s. The Fresh Air series from Mannheim Steamroller, they used to test stereos with that. But there's two different things we're talking about here. First of all, the songs. I look at Toto's first album as being perfect. Boston 1 is a perfect record. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. Don't Shoot Me by Elton John. There's a lot of those. Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon. Some of these albums have both. They sound amazing, and the songs are perfect. When I was talking to Martin Popoff about Judas Priest, I kind of noticed that Martin had written, I've actually read some of his books in the past. And he's an amazing author, but Martin has one of those minds when you interview a guy like this, you want to keep him around for a little while. So we had him with us for a bit. But let's talk about perfect records. In this case with Martin, at least in the beginning, we talk about the sound. And for me, it's always the punch. I want really tight bass. So of course, the Canadian band Max Webster comes up because their albums were so well produced. And Martin's written a book about them. Steely Dan, Pink Floyd, and a lot more coming up with author Martin Popoff, Rock History Music. Martin Popoff is a Canadian music journalist, critic, and author renowned for his extensive work on heavy metal and hard rock. Often dubbed the world's most famous heavy metal journalist, he's penned over 115 books covering various genres, including progressive rock and punk. Popoff co-founded and served as editor-in-chief of Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, Canada's premier metal magazine, which ran from 1994 to 2009. Raised in Trail, British Columbia, Popoff's passion for heavy music was ignited in the early 70s through bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. He earned a BA in English from the University of Victoria and an MBA in marketing from McMaster University. Some of Popoff's books: Riff Kills Man, 25 years of recorded hard rock and heavy metal from 1993. It was a combination of almost 2,000 album reviews, and then that work kind of evolved into the acclaimed Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal series, which spans thousands of reviews across multiple volumes. His bibliography also includes in-depth band biographies like Doom Let Loose on Black Sabbath, Light Beyond the Black on Dio, and Contents Under Pressure, which was about Rush. Popoff has also contributed to a lot of documentaries with banger films, including Rush, Beyond the Lighted Stage, and Metal Evolution. Asia and Gaucho, speaking of perfect albums, man, those two albums have come up a lot in my interviews through the years. What do you think of albums that are accused, especially Steely Dan in that era, of just be sounding too perfect or trying too hard to get the, overthinking it? And what do you think of albums like that?
So to me, I always say that perfect production, the point where you now have perfection and now it's all about just what do you prefer. Strange linking these together. I never used to link them together, but I started to. Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, but I link it now together with Montrose, which I often call the first American heavy metal album, right? And the first amazing sounding American hard rock album, right? So, and I'm updating my old Max Webster book right now to put out again. And I've often said all through that book, you can't get better production than High Class and Borrowed Shoes or A Million Vacations, right? Perfect is perfect, right? And again, once you get to perfect, now the conversation shifts to what do you prefer? Now, so perfect in those days, it would depend on what style of music it's in, but perfect in those days is like everything I mentioned, plus those Steely Dan albums you mentioned, right? And it just means you've got, to me, a perfect production coming out of the 70s is You don't have to turn your treble all the way up to be satisfied. You don't have to turn your bass up all the way up to be satisfied. You're probably going to put those things at around 2 o'clock, right? Or 3 o'clock, kind of thing, which means, the idea is you literally have all the bass you need, you have all the treble you need, and there's nothing weird in the middle. And so every album we just mentioned is like that, except maybe the Montrose, which again is all about, how are we dealing with these super saturated, distorted guitars. But everything else we talked about, Pink Floyd, 2 Max Webster albums, 2 Steely Dan albums, you're basically got this suite of instruments, and you're just trying to capture them as nicely as possible, as plushly, as expensively as possible. And that's what they did. But, along the way, again, we go back to that older discussion where along the way, you've got a lot of people talking about, the locomotive quality or the AM radio translatable quality of shoving a bunch of things into the mid-range, right? So a lot of producers had a mid-range philosophy. But to me, I just wanted to be that guy who could go over to a stereo and say, all right, I don't have to crank the bass to full. I don't have to crank the treble to full. You guys have done a good job.
What's it like where you go back and listen to your old interviews with people? Have you've obviously changed because nothing's constant. What's it like listening to your old interviews when you're having to reference something for maybe a new book or something?
Oh, that is such a funny question, because I was actually thinking about this today, right? Because constantly the idea comes up for our YouTube channel. Go back to my old interviews and find some clips, and we'll put them in and try them. And they never got any good numbers, and we kind of quit it, right? But so and then the other thing comes up. It's like, okay, so that first large bank of interviews is all on cassettes, and they're all numbered, and I got this whole Excel spreadsheet to show where everything is and all this kind of stuff. But I'm scared to just hand them off to a buddy of mine or whatever who wants to, because you want to get these things digitized, right? Because you're embarrassed about the things you maybe bragged about or whatever on these things, or tried to look important in front of this rock star or whatever, right? Or who knows what personal stuff you got talking about at some point, right? Could have been anything, right? I used to ask bands about religion all the time for some reason. I had this long part of this long run where it was like one of my standard questions in there. I don't know why. And then but again, I think of like, oh man, do I really want to just, without checking this tape, just hand off hundreds of tapes to a buddy of mine? And like this buddy of mine is now going to think, this guy's has a big ego on him or something, right? Like I would say, oh yeah, I just had my first book out. Have you heard about it? Or whatever. Or I would tell them about it. My first book of record reviews and stuff. I can think of, probably, if I thought about it, I could think of a lot of things I'm probably embarrassed about that are on those tapes, right? And so here's another funny thing that I've gotten to over the years. You know how when you're young, you don't know what you don't know how much you don't know, or you're just audacious about everything. That's when you take risks, and that's when business people risk and have. So anyway, so I over the years, I've realized that when I've talked to somebody, say I'm talking to somebody who's got 10 albums out by 1990, and I wanted, because I did this whole book series where I just go talk about some super ancient album of theirs, right? But so I would do a lot of asking people total minutiae on things that happened 30, 40 years ago. And I realized, in much later years, like that was being really unreasonable to like make them think about that. And I did not think at the time, like, they've been asked these questions hundreds of times. They're really bored of it. You're going to tick them off asking. So I'm sure I asked a lot of rock stars things that would tick them off, right? That are just too much into like the details of history. But I'm glad I got all that stuff, because I used all that stuff later in books. And some of those stories might have even been the only times they've kind of gone into that.
When you started writing this stuff, because this is about you now, didn't you not find this is the most arduous task in the world? Did you know what you were getting into? Because when you're starting to write, you're taking all these little pieces all over the place, and you've got to make some semblance of like it's got to flow like a movie. How do you do that? And do you have people to do it for?
No, no, I don't have people working for me. I mean, I have to do it all myself. I've had people over the years say, "Oh, let's collaborate on a book," and it just never seems to be you get off the ground.
Is it because you have a system and it
Well,
works?
okay, so I would say out of the 130 books, I would say half of them are band biographies, right? So that is a whole different kettle of fish than any other kind of book. And so the system there is that I generally for those have never thought to write a book on a band until I've talked to them at least 20 times, 25 times. So you got all these interviews and you're slotting stuff into place and you're putting chapters and stuff. And to get even a little more granular, I mean, on the biographies, I will write chapters and I will write about every song. So after a while, I realized a good way to put up a skeleton of a chapter is I'll just put like intro, recording, album cover, song one, song two, song three, song four at the end, wrap up, reviews, concert, like live, and then I'd put that in 24 point, and then I'd start slotting stuff in. So it's good to have, I guess, the general thing. It's good to have some sort of an organizational system so you don't just feel overwhelmed. It's like, oh, where do I start kind of thing, right? But then I've done all these like these album by album books is a whole different idea. The illustrated histories is a different. I've done a whole pile of timeline and quotes books and timeline books just on their own, like visual biographies. I've done 3 books where I've written little analyses or reviews of every single song by a band. So I did that for The Clash, The Damned, and Led Zeppelin. Haven't done any others besides that. But yeah, so there's many different kinds of books. I guess the other thing I would say as a piece of advice is once you get started, don't let long gaps of time happen between, because you gotta stay remembering what you just talked about and stuff. I mean, in the early days, I ran the risk sometimes of taking large chunks of a quote and using it and then not really chopping it, but copying it. So now it's still sitting in some other file and I might use it again on page 250 when I used it already on page 25, right? So just little things like that, right? So yeah, I create chop files of things. So again, to be a little granular, like say if I'm doing a biography, I will take my transcript of someone's interview, right? I will save it and then put in the title the file name chop, and then I will just now this is the double, right? And then I will just take quotes out and reduce it until it's down to nothing. So I've known I've used everything. I haven't used everything twice. I know what I haven't used because it's the chop file, right? So it's that interview minus as I'm moving things over to the book, right? And then all of a sudden I've got this empty interview file. So I go, okay, now I've used all my stuff from this, right? So yeah, there's various little tricks of the trade.
You had mentioned that the second great metal album was a Judas Priest album.
Yeah, so my treatise there. I mean, I won't go through the whole thing, but I've actually written a book called "Who Invented Heavy Metal," which is 120,000 words, and it ends in 1971. So I've looked at that whole birth of metal in granular form, right? So to me, to net it out, I think the real true birth of metal, and I always talk about intentionality of actually making a full album, and that's why on our Contrarians YouTube channel, I've started a new Who Invented Heavy Metal series, and it's an album based series, right? So anyways, so the point is, to me, metal starts properly with Black Sabbath, but we get Black Sabbath, we get Black Sabbath Paranoid, we get Uriah Heep, Very Heavy, Very Humble, we get Deep Purple and Rock. Okay, so that's 1970. And to my mind, you get these things fixed in your mind, and then this ossifies, and that's the way you think forever. But to my mind, from there through 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, we're just getting similar or better versions of something that was already established in 1970. And then when I heard Sad Wings of Destiny for the first time as a new release in 1976, it felt like this was the first band that has really kicked it up a notch, like a new style of singing, better riffs than Black Sabbath, weirdly a baby band with no budget on a small label, right? Happened to be from Birmingham. happen to have been going as long as Black Sabbath. Actually, they started in 1969, believe it or not. First album in '74, but that album was just full of really smart, interesting, complicated, almost progressive metal ideas. So that was kind of the start of not even really, not even really a new kind of music. It's just like the next great album, right? And then at that time we got Rainbow and More Thin Lizzy and UFO and we're moving along. Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, blah blah blah. New wave of British heavy metal. To me, the next really the next actual true invention of anything. And I like to I like to say that so Metallica invents thrash July 25th, 1983 with Kill 'Em All. But I also like to say, and a lot of young people kind of agree with this and think along these terms, that's the invention of metal versus heavy metal, right? So that's the start of metal, because at that point, now you're going to see death metal and black metal and all that, and moving on and metalcore and everything. So yeah, to me, Judas Priest, I guess the other point around that Sad Wings of Destiny sort of clip is that I've always said this, in this I also believe that the greatest run of pure objective genius in all of music, I don't know my jazz, but in all of rock, I will put this up against U2, Bob Dylan, all your most critically acclaimed bands. I think the most genius run of in all of rock is that Judas Priest run from Sad Wings to Hellbent for Leather, tied with Queen One to Queen Jazz, and that's it. There's no other like these guys are just operating on just a way higher level. Everything's smarter about everything they're doing for a big run of albums in a row. So yeah, that's kind of that big important 76 sort of period for Priest. 76. So 76, 77, 78, 78. You get 4 albums in those 3 years.
What brought me into this band with Priest was the riffs. I remember going, I could not escape a riff that was so catchy as this. And I ended up liking the band in spite of myself, and guitar riffs that were like undeniable to me. I'm going, I can't not like this.
Yeah. Yeah, they were complicated, interesting, and Sin After Sin. You got Simon Phillips on drums, so it's almost like jazzy progressive metal. I always say Rush invented progressive metal, but if you want to go down the more metal end rather than the progressive end, Judas Priest was very, very progressive at that time as well. And Stained Class is completely scientific and weirdly thinly trebly recording, and yeah, just riff after riff is just smarter than every riff. Forget about American bands. Like they can't even, they're like drawing with crayons compared to these to Priest. But even like I say, even better than Rainbow, even better than Black Sabbath. They're just and again, that new style of singer, this very technical operatic sort of singing, nobody had ever done that before. So that was a new thing as well. And yeah, and even just the strangely sort of timeless lyrics. I always joke that Sad Wings of Destiny, all the lyrics on there could have been written in the 1400s, and the most modern song on it is The Ripper, which is 150 years old. Right. The story from that. I mean, and everything else can be literally timeless. It's just, there's no cars, there's no fax machines, there's no, nothing like that. There's no mention of the internet or, so that's funny as well. So it had this sort of timeless, epic sort of quality that you didn't get too many places.
Well, Sad Wings, were they really that poor when they did that album?
Oh, heck yeah. They were poor 3-4 albums forward. They were poor all the way up until really the live album Semi broke, and then British Steel broke. I mean, they had no money. Their deal even with CBS, they would spend all that money. You go on tour. They were a small band. They were a cult band. A lot of metalheads. I mean, all the people who would start thrash bands and stuff just loved the hell out of this band. They were literally, by far the smartest, coolest heavy metal band, but they were still a cult band. But at Sad Wings, they're just on their second album. They're still with Gull Records. They have no money at all. And really, it's not until 79 they start making any money.
There's certain groups, there's a mentality, there's a certain camaraderie in every genre, and metal certainly has a. What did you find about metal fans
Yeah,
writing?
I think it's a very scholarly sort of thing. I remember when the internet first started, and I know when it started. It was really 1996 is exactly when it sort of started being actually used by people, right? But I remember for those first few years, people used to say, "Wow, there's a lot of people talking about heavy metal all over this new internet thing, right?" And so it was really like that. And prog people are really scholarly like that as well. And that's why, people joke about Rush fans because it's prog and metal. They're the most scholarly of everybody. You go to the Rush conventions and stuff, and everybody's pretty wealthy and got good jobs and they're really smart and all that kind of thing, right? So yeah, metal fans love the whole history and charting that whole thing. I've seen a few debates. I haven't gotten way into it, but I know there's a certain thing like how in hip hop, for example, people pay very little attention to the past and things move super fast, and it's really been compressed down to song by song by song. So there's different cultures the way people embrace their music genres, but yeah, the metal fandom is super deep. You got to know your history. You got to know all the different names of the genres and all that stuff and who's in the bands and everything. It's a pretty music snobbery kind of field, I think.
Sin after sin. Simon, what happened with? I talked to Simon, and a lot of fans gave me hell. You didn't ask about him playing with Priest, and I'm going, how did that happen?
Yeah, so they're losing their drummer, and they just had to get someone, and they get Simon in there, who's young. I don't know. What have I heard? 18 years old, maybe 18, 20 years
Yeah.
old or something. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. And it's a bit of a question, like who is driving what, how much influence did he have on them? But they were already, doing these menza mad fast sort of riffs and being very complicated with what they're doing. But for some reason, him in conjunction with his sort of jazzy style and this pretty out of character production quality Roger Glover gets at the time. Again, it was very thin and high minded and conceptual, almost what he was doing production wise, because he didn't sound like that with Nazareth. Or what are we 77, so that's really it, just Nazareth. He wasn't ever producing Deep Purple yet, but Nazareth's very conservative, normal meat and potatoes recordings, right? So yeah, for whatever reason that came out very very jazzy. He plays a little bit like a jazz fusion version of a Bill Ward, I suppose. And then he just they asked him, I think, to stay on and be their drummer and stuff. And he had some other stuff planned and he had to just go off and do his thing. Maybe he wasn't particularly a metalhead or wasn't super driven, but it's really funny though, how, this is the to the merit of the heavy metal genre. I often say, like, I have this whole thing, talking about how people love heavy metal, they just don't know it, and that's why people in the Beatles and fans of the Beatles get excited by Helter Skelter. That's why people get excited by, Mark Knopfler turning on a distortion pedal for the opening riff of Money for Nothing or whatever it's called, right? That's why Heart Barracuda is their most famous song, right? But people like Simon and people like Viv Campbell when it comes to Dio versus Def Leppard and stuff, and a few other guys who have been on metal albums, it's like, because metal people are so scholarly, when Simon Phillips goes to his grave, one of the main things he's going to remembered for is just drumming on a stupid Judas Priest album, right? It's totally true. And Viv Campbell is always going to be remembered, no matter how much fame and fortune he has with Def Leppard. He's always going to be remembered as that guy in Dio. So that happens a lot out there, I think.
Raw Deal from Sin After Sin. So that was really Rob kind of like sort of letting people know. And I would think sexuality, there's that stereotype in metal. I mean, he was grappling with Rob with that tune, Raw Deal. Was he really sort of slowly showing his
Yeah, pretty interesting. I remember it going over my head and not really noticing. Number one, I didn't have the lyric sleeve in Canada. We get ripped off with a lot of that stuff. I can't even remember if it had lyrics anywhere else, but mine didn't have any inner sleeve. I know Stained Class did, and in the UK, and ours didn't. But yeah, that was it's pretty impressive looking back. I mean, nobody really talked about it back then, right? It
No.
took a long time for anybody to even notice, although possibly people were a little more enlightened than we give them credit for. It's like there was probably some subconscious level of noticing and not even caring about it to even bring it up, right? Because you see the outfits as you go along, and I remember even all the way up until he literally started talking about it, which was, I think it was like the late 90s or something, right? Around that 2 album coming out, right? So it was long, long time later. But everybody kind of slowly knew as time went on, just sort of like Freddie. But I don't remember really anybody really talking about it very much. But you're right, Raw Deal is it's a pretty direct lyric. So
I started thinking about Elton John and his sexuality. It made me, it's strange. I made a connection and I went, it's strange. A lot of people would never think about sexuality when they found out when Elton John sort of let it out in the Rolling Stone interview. In the beginning, some of my friends just jumped off the ship. My best friend jumped off the ship, and I'm going, really? Like, really? You're going to give up on Elton? Because I was the biggest Elton John fan in the world in the 70s. And other people just kind of went, well, I let me learn more about this. And that's the majesty of having a following that will say, hey, you got to trust me. Like certain labels have certain labels in music. You have a trust. It's rare, or certain bands, especially, you have a trust in them. So they will take you there. And I remember a few of my friends, when Rob was kind of letting it out a little bit, a few of my friends were going, well, I love Rob and I don't care. And I remember going, well, there's a good thing. There you go. You trust the guy. You've learned to trust him as a man or as a lyricist or as a vocalist. And I like that. But I got that. I got it from Elton, but after that, I got that from Rob Halford. I remember going, oh, that's cool.
yeah, I don't remember anybody being upset about it or dropping Judas Priest
Yeah.
for any reason. I mean, nobody. I mean, people would make little jokes about it and cracks about it, but it was even when that happened, it was kind of in fun, right? It was just making fun of them for just make fun of someone for being drunk or whatever, right? But nobody ever dropped Priest, and nobody ever dropped Queen. I don't remember that, and I don't remember anybody really dropping Elton either.
Remember, comment on our video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos. We'd appreciate that. When you subscribe, click the bell notification so you don't miss anything and keep coming back. And always check the description of our videos because we have a lot of links to other videos in there that we think you'll enjoy. If you want to make a donation, there is a PayPal link at the very top of the description. I'm John Bowden. Take care of yourself. This is Rock History Music.